The First World War, also known as the Great War, was a global conflict that lasted from 1914 to 1918. It involved the major world powers of the time, divided into two opposing alliances, the Allies, led by France, Great Britain, and Russia, and the Central Powers, led by Germany, Austria-Hungary, and the Ottoman Empire. The war was the result of a complex set of factors, including long-standing tensions between European powers, the rise of nationalism, and the competition for colonies and resources. The outbreak of war was triggered by the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand of Austria-Hungary in June 1914, which was carried out by a Serbian nationalist. Austria-Hungary, backed by Germany, responded with a series of demands on Serbia, which led to a diplomatic crisis that escalated into war. The war quickly spread throughout Europe, and by the end of the year, most of the major powers had joined the conflict. The early years of the war were marked by swift military advances and retreats, with both sides trying to gain the upper hand. The Germans, led by General Erich Ludendorff, attempted to defeat the Allies with a series of offensives on the Western Front, but were ultimately unsuccessful. The Allies, led by General Ferdinand Foch, launched a counteroffensive in the summer of 1918 that pushed the Germans back, and by November of that year, Germany had signed an armistice that effectively ended the war. The First World War had a profound impact on the world, both in the short term and the long term. It claimed the lives of millions of soldiers and civilians, and caused immense destruction to towns, cities, and infrastructure. It also reshaped the geopolitical landscape of Europe, leading to the collapse of the Ottoman and Austro-Hungarian empires, and the emergence of new nations in their place. The war also paved the way for the rise of totalitarianism in Europe, and set the stage for the Second World War just a few decades later. One of the most significant aspects of the First World War was the use of new military technologies, such as tanks, airplanes, and chemical weapons. These technologies allowed for unprecedented levels of destruction and changed the nature of warfare. The use of chemical weapons, in particular, was a major innovation that had a devastating impact on soldiers and civilians alike. Mustard gas, for example, caused severe burns and respiratory damage, and could linger in the environment for days or even weeks. The war also had a profound impact on the home front, as governments mobilized their populations and economies in support of the war effort. Propaganda campaigns were used to rally public support for the war and to demonize the enemy. Women played a significant role in the war effort, both as workers in factories and as nurses and aid workers on the front lines. The war also led to social and political upheaval, as people questioned traditional authority structures and demanded greater rights and freedoms. Perhaps the most tragic aspect of the First World War was the toll it took on human life. The war claimed the lives of an estimated 8.5 million soldiers and 13 million civilians. Many of these deaths were the result of trench warfare, a grueling and often brutal form of warfare in which soldiers dug in to defend their positions from enemy attacks. Please subscribe Novel Notions for more review. The conditions in the trenches were appalling, with soldiers living in cramped, dirty, and often disease-ridden conditions. They were also subjected to constant shelling and gunfire, which could cause severe psychological trauma. The war also had a profound impact on culture and the arts. Many writers, poets, and artists were inspired by the war and produced works that reflected the trauma and devastation of the conflict. The war also led to the emergence of new artistic movements, such as Dadaism and Surrealism, which rejected traditional forms of art and sought to create works that challenged societal norms and conventions. One of the most well-known examples of this artistic response to the war is the poetry of Wilfred Owen. Owen was a British soldier who fought on the Western Front and was killed just a week before the armistice was signed. His poetry, which often depicted the horrors of trench warfare and the suffering of soldiers, has become an iconic representation of the war. One of his most famous poems, Dulce et Decorum Est, describes a gas attack and its impact on the soldiers. Gas. Gas. Quick, boys. An ecstasy of fumbling. Fitting the clumsy helmets just in time. But someone still was yelling out and stumbling. And floundering like a man in fire or lime. Dim, through the misty panes and thick green light. As under a green sea, I saw him drowning. Owen's poetry, along with the works of other artists and writers, helped to shape the public perception of the war and its impact on society. In addition to the human toll, the First World War had significant economic consequences. The war was incredibly expensive, and many nations went into debt to finance their war efforts. The war also disrupted global trade and caused inflation, leading to economic instability in many parts of the world. The Treaty of Versailles, which officially ended the war in 1919, imposed heavy reparations on Germany, which further exacerbated economic instability in Europe. The political consequences of the war were also significant. The collapse of the Austro-Hungarian and Ottoman empires led to the emergence of new nation-states in Europe and the Middle East. The war also contributed to the rise of nationalism and the breakdown of traditional power structures, paving the way for the emergence of totalitarian regimes in the years that followed. Perhaps the most significant political consequence of the war was the Treaty of Versailles, which imposed harsh penalties on Germany and created the League of Nations, an international organization intended to prevent future wars. However, the treaty was widely seen as unfair by many Germans and contributed to the rise of Hitler and the Nazi Party in the 1930s. In conclusion, the First World War was a global conflict that had a profound impact on the world. It claimed the lives of millions of soldiers and civilians, and caused immense destruction and devastation. It also reshaped the geopolitical landscape of Europe and the Middle East, and paved the way for the rise of totalitarianism and the Second World War. The war was a tragic and senseless event, but it also inspired some of the greatest artistic and literary works of the 20th century, and its legacy continues to shape the world today. Please subscribe Novel Notions for more review.